Our last speaker today is Charles Stanley with the 464th Bombgroup Association. Charles is in the process of publishing a book about the lost airmen, U.S. bomber crews stranded behind enemy lines in Yugoslavia during World War II. I've started reading this book. It is an excellent manuscript. And please welcome to the stage, Charles Stanley.
I got to do a little sound check. There we go. Great. By the way, I want to thank you two for ruining the audience, and now I got two tough acts to follow. So what am I going to do here? All right. So my presentation is far different from any of the others that you've heard, because it's only about 10% of what I deal with in my upcoming book is about what happens in the air. A lot of it is what happens after the guy. Part of it is how they get to where they are and get shot down, but most of it is about what happened to them after they get shot down and need to come back. So that'll be a little departure from what we've been doing. So it's called U.S. Bomber Crews Stranded Behind Enemy Lines in Yugoslavia in World War II. And it's about 13 crews specifically, and I'll get to each one of them in turn. And let's move on. So, as I said, it's about how they get there, how they get out, the context, meaning why they're there, why they're flying their missions, and what sort of situation they dropped into in Yugoslavia. And I have to tell you that practically none of them were briefed on the extremely complex situation on the ground in Yugoslavia. So all these fellows that I'm going to talk about dropped into a foreign land with an extremely complex situation. Everybody's familiar with the Serbian wars and the Balkan wars in the 1990s, and you know what a mess that was. And it was pretty much the same then. So these fellows who entered into this milieu had absolutely no briefing on what was happening there and kind of had to sort it out for themselves. And even more so, it's about the experience. It's about the experience of flying, of being shot down, being in a field of flak, what it felt like, and how they dealt with it. So it's based on 20 years of research. I was working full-time when I began the book, and I began by interviewing the fellows who many of whom I knew would not last until I finally finished the book. So I've got 40 interviews. The book is about 130 men. And it's also based on a lot of unpublished diaries, manuscripts, out-of-print books. It is, I think I'm skipping ahead a slide, but it will be the first book ever written that concentrates on the U.S. Airmen helped by the partisans in Yugoslavia. Some of you have probably read the Forgotten 500, which talks about airmen helped by the Chetnik faction, but this will be the first book that concentrates on the far greater number that was helped by the Yugoslavian partisans. By way of background, about 2,500 airmen were shot down, or I shouldn't say shot down, came down over Yugoslavia during World War II, and I'll get to that. And about 4/5 of them were helped by partisans rather than by the Chetniks. I think one of the reasons I was asked to speak today is because I cover 13 crews, but there are 12 bomb groups, and many of those bomb groups are represented here today. So, and I'll sort of give a shout out as I go along. But these are the 13 crews, and you'll see that, many, as I said, many of you here, the 485th, 44th, and so on, are represented in my book. A lot of history is dependent on geography. And I threw this map in so that you would understand how these guys ended up in Yugoslavia. You might ask, why Yugoslavia? And the answer is because you'll see from the map that I think most of you know that our airmen began in the boot of Italy, would fly up in almost due north, maybe a little even northwest, to their targets in the Third Reich, get shot up over the targets, and could only get so far back. And sometimes they had maps of where the partisans might be, sometimes they didn't, depending upon what part of the war it was. Their planes either ran out of gas, or they'd run out of engines, or they had mechanical failure of just normal maintenance, and they'd bail out. And it turned out right below the O in Croatia there was a safe zone that was held by the partisans, whereas most of the rest of the country was held by the Germans. Some of them knew where that was, so they'd head for that area and bail out or crash land. So, while the main thrust of this is about these 13 air crews and how they fared with the partisans, each air crew also tells its own story. Each air crew has sort of a theme to it. And I won't run through all these right now because they're in the latest slides. But each one sort of presents an excuse to get into some other facet of the air war besides the adventure of ending up with the underground and with British spies and dodging Germans and somehow getting back. I'll go to my father's crew, for example. I start with my father, not because he's my father, but because thousands of the letters between my parents survived the war, and they cover his training period. So I start with him, talk about how he was selected, how he was trained, and so by the time you get through the first two chapters that cover that period, you understand what an elite force these men were. I'm sure most of you understand that anyway, but you, the reader, understand what elite guys these were, what sort of rigorous training they went through, and really what kind of men they were, and we all know what kind of men. We also get to the situation in Yugoslavia. As I said, they were not briefed on this. There were two main factions who were fighting against the Germans in Yugoslavia. Marshal Tito's partisans, they were communists, and General Mihailovic's Chetniks, they were primarily Serbian, and they were basically loyal to the king. And at first, the British backed the Chetniks because the king of Serbia had fled to England and set up a government in exile. And as the war went on, the Chetniks sort of faltered, and Tito's men sort of rose in terms of the amount of territory that they controlled all over the country. And it's sort of a ironic situation because, I think I have to push buttons every now and then just to keep it alive. I need help.
Coming.
So what happened was that the Germans had a policy that they would kill 100 Yugoslavians for every German soldier who was killed. And that slowed down the Chetniks considerably. They were soldiers. They weren't. They were trying to prevent the reprisals. And we have to remember that World War I began in Serbia, or actually Croatia, but it was fought by the Serbians. Serbians had suffered terrible losses then, and they were actually afraid that Serbians would be pretty much wiped out if they kept going. So they fought, but they didn't fight as ardently as they might have because they were afraid of the reprisals. Tito didn't care. Tito didn't care about the reprisals because he's a communist, and chaos is part of the plan. So, and in the end, the general populace preferred that over sort of the more docile approach taken by Mihaljevich's Chetniks. And then we go through the crews one by one. When I talk about Scotty Stewart's crew, shout out to the 485th. The theme here is the difficulty these men had in forming crews. And it isn't like you just slap a bunch of guys together from all over the country. And I think it's difficult for maybe young people today to understand what a different country it was then. When you grow up in the 1920s and 1930s, you probably didn't stray farther than 50 miles from your home. And you didn't have televisions, and you didn't meet anybody who was from a different part of the country, or at least rarely.
Well, you just jumped ahead one slide.
Uh-oh. So the...
Hit escape. There you go.
There we go. So here they were, and some of the other speakers have touched on this. If you're 25 years old on a crew, you're old. They're 20, 22-year-old guys. One of them's a pilot, and he has to earn the respect of other 20-year-old guys. And it's not easy. And that's what that chapter emphasizes. Then we have our second crew from the 464th. I start with Lieutenant Robert Dean, landing on the Isle of Vies. We've talked about Vies earlier today as well. That was an island off the Adriatic coast, an emergency landing field that the British had, and many airmen's lives were saved by landing on Vies. I emphasize this a little bit because one of the reasons I wrote this book is to correct a lot of misperceptions that are out there in other books, including the Wild Blue. Wild Blue is inaccurate in a lot of ways. And for Stephen Ambrose says that you couldn't take off from Vies. Well, these guys did. Not only did he, but Bob Dean and another pilot we're going to meet later, Lieutenant David Blood, also landed on Vies, and they took off the same day. So that's just one of many places where Stephen Ambrose is wrong. But Dean gets shot down, he lands near Drvar, and then this is Tito and his men in Drvar, and they actually take the same escape route that Tito did when the Germans tried to capture him in May of '44. Here's a B-17 crew, and here's a chance to talk about the old debate between B-24s and B-17s. I was glad to see that even now that we have B-17 groups joining our reunions, that there have been pretty much no arguments over which was the better airplane, the B-24 or the B-17. So I commend all of you for your restraint in that vicious debate. But this is also a chance to talk about the prejudices that existed at the time, and I think everybody's well familiar with the prejudices against African Americans, and that they were in a separate unit, the Tuskegee Airmen, all that. But I think what's less understood is that there were other prejudices as well. It was very difficult to become a pilot if you were not what was perceived to be Anglo-Saxon, or if you didn't have that kind of a surname. If your name ended in a vowel, or if you were Jewish, it wasn't so easy. You had a tougher road to climb because the Air Corps was an old guard of gentlemen, basically. Gentlemen perceived to be upper class and well-educated, and that's how they wanted the Air Corps to be. So when they needed to expand the Air Corps exponentially, they needed to reach out beyond college graduates, and it wasn't like the standards were lower. There were still very high standards, but it broadened the base that the Air Corps was drawing from. And this is a picture of Larry Rosenthal. He was a brilliant man, one of my better friends on the group, but he suffered the sort of normal anti-Semitic prejudice that existed at the time. You'll find a lot of Jewish navigators and bombardiers because Jews were supposed to be good with numbers, right? But not so many pilots. And one Jewish pilot was mentioned today, but not very often. Not very often. So these 5 crews gather in this town in Bosnia called Sanski Most. This is a postcard, by the way, before the war of the town. A lot of the guys brought them back with them as souvenirs. But it talks about life in Bosnia at the time, how the Germans had reprisals there. There had been a mass execution of over 1,000 people just outside of town. And it just talks about how the guys settle in, and they're basically the area is surrounded by retreating Germans. The Germans are being pushed out of the Balkans by the British, but they're all around this sort of enclave that's the safe place for the airmen to go. Then suddenly the population explodes, and it explodes because the Air Corps, the Air Force, was initiated a what's called the oil blitz. They had decided to knock out Germany's oil production once and for all in mid-December, and those oil targets like Bleckhammer and Floresdorf and all the other synthetic oil plants become the major targets in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of December. And it just, I don't know how much you know, so, it's hard for me to tell how much background to give you or not, but you know that Germany has pretty much no oil. And when Ploesti fell, they had 0 oil. And but they had lots of coal. So so these synthetic oil plants were creating aviation gasoline out of coal, and that's why they were such high priority targets. And most of these guys got shot down over synthetic oil plants. Here's Hercule Marone, one of my favorite guys, Italian, a rare guy who, with a vowel at the end of his name, who managed to become a pilot. Also unique because he, unlike many of the airmen, was a true volunteer. Most guys joined the Air Corps because they didn't want to be in the mud. My father joined because he didn't want to be in the mud for the whole war. He just couldn't see himself doing that. Marone had a deferment because he was the sole support of his mother. And he joined anyway, and joined truly the most dangerous branch of the service. You know that the losses in the Air Corps were at a higher rate than the Marines in the Pacific. So to volunteer and join an elite force, but that happened to also have an extremely high loss rate, took a lot of guts, and I give him a lot of credit for it. So he ends up in Stanley Most as well. The Eldridge crew is an excuse to talk about the stress of aerial combat, because basically right after they took some hits over their target, half the crew bailed out without orders, which is something like abandoning your ship at sea without orders. It's basically a mutiny, and it's sort of an understandable human failing. So it talks about how the air war was unique in that frame of time, that there's never been a form of warfare like it before or since. You know how these guys had to fly over their targets straight and steady into a monstrous field of exploding flak shells and just take it. There's no hiding, there's no way to protect yourself, there's no nothing. And either one of those shell fragments has your name on it or it doesn't. And the helpless feeling is unlike anything else anybody suffered during the war. And that's, I think, is why there's such a high rate of PTSD after the war among airmen. The Marshall Crew. Marshall Crew is the 461st. I love these two photographs. They actually went down because of mechanical failure, and that's a way to illustrate how important the ground crew was. The ground crews, of course, kept the planes in the air, loved their planes as much as the pilots did, took really good care of them. only the United States had the most mechanized country in the world, had the kind of base of mechanics to support that kind of an Air Force at that time. And yet, these planes get beat up, and some of them fail. It's just the way it was. So they have mechanical problems. They bail out over northern Yugoslavia. And the fellow on the right is named Jan Roklowski. He was a Polish national. Well, he was an American citizen. His parents had come over to America. His father had had a job in America, made some money, went back to the old country, as used to happen actually a lot. And so Jan is stuck in Poland when the Germans take over in 1939. And being an American citizen doesn't help him at all. So he somehow, and there's a long story on this, but he somehow manages to cross Europe in the middle of World War II, get to Lisbon, get to America, and then because he's an American citizen, get drafted. So he ends up on the airplane. Oops. And and he goes down, parachutes down, and ends in a swamp. And two German soldiers in a skiff pick him up. And and then they start paddling around looking for the other guys who bailed out. Well, what these two poor German soldiers didn't know is that they had an Olympic class athlete in their boat. Jan would have been in the 1940 Olympics swimming for Poland if the war hadn't begun. So, and he was an expert canoeist and kayaker as well. So here's these Germans in a swamp in full gear, backpacks, heavy coats. So Jan just tips the boat over, Germans sink, and he spoke German. So the Germans are talking to each other. He knows exactly what they're saying. They have no clue he knows what they're saying. They get near an island, he tips the boat over, they sink like rocks, and he's off free. Frank Dick is one of my great tragedies. He unfortunately landed on solid ground, fortunately, but unfortunately was picked up by an SS man, taken to the site of the plane crash. And this was all corroborated by Yugoslavian civilians. Questioned about the airplane and refused to answer, and the Nazis shot him in the head. Harry Blank for the 451st. This is one of my more important crews because half of these guys ended up rescued by the Chetniks and half of them ended up with the partisans. So this gives me a chance to discuss the sort of far different fates of men who were helped by the partisans versus those who ended up with the Chetniks. And by this time, the Americans, or the British basically, had cut off all ties to the Chetniks at Tito's insistence. And so four of these guys end up with the Chetniks, and they end up, some of you are aware of Operation Halyard that's discussed in the Forgotten 500. So the last American mission leaves that area on December 27, 1944. Last airmen, last OSS guys, they fly out. These guys end up there 2 hours later. And there's no way to even contact the Americans anymore. Bad luck. And the rest of them end up in Sansky Most with the rest of my guys. Here's the 465th. I just love this picture. That guy looks like he's ready to go. I think I'll skip that story in the interest of time, but those of you from the 465th ask me about it later on. That's a good story. So these, as I said, all our Americans are trapped behind enemy lines, and they don't even have a way to contact the Allies and tell them where they are. The partisans are doing a good job of bringing them all into one place, but there's no contact with headquarters. So the Americans hear that there's a British mission about 40 miles away. They send a letter to them, and the British respond. And at first they make the Americans confirm who they are, give them serial numbers and name of commanders and all that sort of thing. And then the British agents show up in town, and the mission name is codenamed Icarus. So there's a British major, captain, and a radio man with them. And they arrive just at the same time as Frederick Coe's plane shows up, and so that chapter covers that. Now, Wolfe, John Wolfe. John Wolfe is one of the great heroes of my book. He was shot up, as they all were, most of them were. And the unfortunate thing was that he gives the order to bail out, and actually 3 of his crewmen in the back of the airplane were busy discarding weight so the plane could go further after they were shot up. And they had gone off the headphones, and so they didn't hear the bailout order when the bailout order came. And by the time that Wolfe figured it out, everybody else had bailed out. Wolfe decided he was going to ride the plane in and try to save those men. So he crash landed the plane on a mountainside in Bosnia. And just to give you a sense of what Bosnia is like, because I'm sure nobody's been there, but it shouldn't be there. It's basically like the Adirondacks in northern New York. It's pretty. It's not the Rockies, but it's pretty rugged. You know, mountain peaks of about 4,000 or 5,000 feet, all forest, no roads, very little in the way of transportation, but forested. So this guy tried to crash land his plane on a mountainside into fir trees, and somehow managed to save one of those men. So he sacrificed his life trying to save those men, and succeeded in saving one of them. Here's another B-17 crew, Ted Kaiser, and one of my favorite things about this chapter is that it gives me an excuse to talk about conscientious objectors, because not many, I think most of us are familiar with conscientious objectors later on in the Vietnam War and so forth. But there were very few conscientious objectors in World War II, and naturally that was frowned upon much more than it was later. And it gives me a chance to delve into that and talk about how Jim Martin's brother was basically a prisoner in North Dakota, and that Congress was so strapped by public opinion against conscientious objectors that they wouldn't even appropriate funds to support them. So they basically would have starved if the peace churches hadn't supported them, the Quakers and the Brethren and so forth. So all these new airmen come into town, and the place starts to become overwhelmed. Each American carries $48 in his escape kit in gold-backed dollars, which means that every American in town was richer than probably the whole town put together when he arrives there. So naturally, the townspeople are saving all their goods to sell to the Americans, and the rest of the townspeople are starting to complain about it. And worse, remember, these are communists, so you're supposed to share everything. Nobody's supposed to be better than anybody else. There's not supposed to be anybody who's rich and soaking up all the resources. And here's these conspicuous consumers coming into town and buying everything up. And I think what actually probably ticked them off more, these are 20, 22-year-old males, right? They come into town, they're rich, they're exotic, and the chicks dig them. So, you can understand why the partisan males were getting a little ticked off at the Americans. And now my final crew arrives, and the villain of my story arrives. So I mentioned David Blood before. He was the one, he landed on V's with the Dean crew earlier in the story. Aboard is a man named Captain Johnson, and he's a flight surgeon. And what he would do is he would ride once a month on a bombing mission, just to collect flight pay, which basically increased his basic pay by 50%. So it was getting near the end of the month, so it's December 26th, and you couldn't pick your missions. Like you couldn't just pick a milk run because you didn't know what you were going to get till you showed up at your mission briefing. So he shows up, and it turns out that it's Black Hammer, which we've heard is one of the toughest targets in Germany. But if he wants to go, he's got to go on this mission. So he ends up riding along, and I just love this picture here because that's him with his flight gear, taken with his camera. So instead of carrying a medical bag with him, he carries his Brownie camera. So even if somebody had gotten wounded aboard the plane, he really wouldn't have been much good as a flight surgeon. And I think that goes partially to what really happened in the air back then. Usually, flight surgeons spent most of their time dealing with combat stress rather than with wounds. If you were wounded in the air, your plane usually flew to Bari and took you to the hospital, and the flight surgeons back at the base really didn't deal with it. So the flight surgeons didn't do much surgery. They mostly worked on psychological stress. And it's worth emphasizing, Johnson is a captain, and nobody else in town is a captain. So when he arrives in Sansky Most with these 84 other Americans, or 83 other Americans, he is the senior officer. Now, before he shows up, all the Americans basically, when they're there, there's no rank, or very little rank. You know, your pilot is your pilot, but within town there's no hierarchy. There's no boss of the Americans. They all they communicate to the local partisan commandant through the first crew that happened to arrive. That was Larry Rosenthal and Bob Bardish. But they were just there because they happened to be there first, and they had struck up a rapport with the commandant, and there was no such thing as a hierarchy. Johnson decides he's going to be in charge. So this is called At the Mercy of Friends, which is the way it was. The British agents contact Bari. They ask for planes. Planes come 3 times. They circle overhead over this field outside of this little town in Bosnia, surrounded by these high mountains. They cannot penetrate the undercast because they're afraid they're going to run into one of the mountains on the way down. And so they have flown all the way from Italy. The guys go out to the field. They're looking up. They can hear them. They can't see them. And then the planes just fade away into the distance. And you can just imagine their disappointment when they came so close, but no cigar. So the partisans kind of get fed up with it. And after the 3rd time, and even in Yugoslavia, 3 strikes meant you were out. So they basically kick him out of town. They put him on a little toy train like this, which looks like something out of a Buster Keaton movie, wood-fueled, and on flat cars. And remember, this is the same time as the Battle of the Bulge, the worst winter of the 20th century. And it was true not just in Belgium, but it was true all over Europe. So they send them out, 84 guys with almost no food, and expect them to walk through a mountain, the Carpathian Alps, to the Yugoslavian coast, and it just wasn't going to happen. The train gets stuck in the snow, tries to back out, gets stuck again, and the guys have to walk back to town to add to their indignities. Meanwhile, the British agents' batteries have run out, and they can't contact Barry again. So now everybody's really stuck. But somehow, of course, the Americans had radio men on every crew, right? So he knew how to fix the radio. Actually, they fixed the generator, fixed the radio, managed to contact Barry again. 3 C-47s arrive, and they managed to land. And everybody has agreed previously during those 3 rescue attempts that the priority was the wounded naturally would go first, right? There were a good dozen badly wounded men. Next, everybody would leave in order of their arrival. Some of these guys had been there for 6 weeks or so. And then you know, the most recent would take last priority. My father, well, let's go, actually, the C-47s, I think you know, are the workhorses of the sky. They're the primary transport plane of the war. And the kids have seen them in Indiana Jones movies. That's what Indiana Jones was flying around in all the time. So the major in charge of the rescue operation tells them that he can only take 22 men apiece because that's what the plane is rated at. What he sort of didn't recognize was that the 22 men applies to paratroopers, not to basically just carrying guys around. Paratroopers carry 80 pounds of backpack apiece. So obviously you can carry a lot more weight than 22 men account for. And you know, several of our guys in Sansky Most are pilots. They know this. They're trying to persuade the major that yes, we can fit more guys. It's by weight. We could fit everybody if we really tried. And the major refuses, and he actually pulls out a 45 and trains it on him and says, no, I'm only taking 66 guys. So that means 18 men need to stay behind. So my father, being the idealist that he was, even though he was one of the earliest crews in town, volunteers his men to stay behind, except for 2 of the men that were wounded. So that leaves 10 more men that need to stay. And that would be the blood crew. We saw that the blood crew was the last crew to arrive in town, right? Except Dr. Johnson says, no, 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 no. I want to be on that plane. And I'm a captain. And he orders 4 men off the last airplane to put himself and 3 others from the blood crew, including blood, on that airplane. And when I interviewed those guys who were kicked off that plane 40 years later, they were still ticked off. You can't blame them. So begins the desperate journey. So now our 18 men need to walk across Yugoslavia, much like they tried to send all of them before. And at least it's a little easier with only 18 men. And but remember, again, it's the worst winter of the 20th century. It's been blizzard conditions for a month. Another blizzard falls while they're halfway across the Dinaric Alps. They get stuck in sort of a woodsman's shack on the side of a mountain, and the snow's piling so high that the partisans are wandering around outside trying to clear the snow so that they won't suffocate from the snow covering the windows and the chimneys. Now, 2 of their partisan escorts decide that they're going to make a break for it. And one of them was an officer who wore only no overcoat, just a regular uniform, and he had some dispatches that apparently needed to carry through. He thought it was really important. So he takes off with an aide to try to get through to the next station, maybe 12 miles away. They take off, and maybe 8 hours later, the aide comes back, and the captain's gone. And the aide has a black foot. He's frostbitten. And you know, now they're really desperate, because not only are they stuck in this cabin in the middle of nowhere, they've got no food, they've got nothing. And they decide that they've got no choice. The next day they're going to press on. They're either going to make it to the next stop, or they're going to freeze to death. But they had to leave that frostbitten partisan behind because they couldn't carry it. 6 feet of snow. They're swimming through the snow like this for 12 miles. They weren't going to carry it. There was no stretcher anyway. There was no way they were going to be able to carry this guy. And they just had to leave him behind. But in the end, they do reach safety, and you know, are processed and deloused and everything else that happens to airmen after they come back from being missing. So then I circle back to the guys who would become POWs on these same airplanes, and I tell the stories of the POWs. We talked a little bit about POWs earlier. Some of them end up in Stella with 3 with your friend or your friend's brother. And they participate in what's called the Black March. And I'm sure many of you haven't heard of the Black March, but what happened was the Russians are advancing, and the Germans decide that they're going to retreat and prevent the Russians from liberating the Americans. So, you know, at the end of February, and it actually began in March, and they had no food either. So they basically just start walking across Germany with absolutely no provisions, and several hundred Americans died on that Black March. So it was not easy to be a POW. It was better than being a Japanese POW. But if you were in one of these camps that needed to be vacated, it was not easy. So several of my men survived the Black March. The exception was Stalag Luft 1, where Zemke, who's on the right here, refused to go. And he took a calculated risk. He said, you know what, several hundred of my guys are going to die anyway. They drilled, they armed themselves, they were ready to fight the Germans and just make a stand there rather than endure that march. And the Germans caved and let them stay. The Germans took off, and the Russians liberated the camp. And that's one of the great, I think, untold stories of World War II that would make it just an absolutely terrific movie if that ever happened. So, and now we come back to our friend Harry Blank and his 3 men. They've been with the Chetniks all this time, and the book goes into how differently they were treated. All the Yugoslavian people, don't get me wrong, were extremely generous to Americans. They loved Americans. They knew that Americans were doing their best for them, had absolutely no territorial interest. As opposed, they didn't like the British because they thought the British had designs on Yugoslavia, and they did. They knew that Americans were there altruistically, and an airman was king. And by Slavic tradition, you know, if you were a guest, you got everything, and even if the family had to starve the next day. So they treated the Americans great. But here's Mihailovich. He has not just these 4 Americans, but about 20 others. And the Blank and his friends say, we basically want to go to the partisans. If the partisans are in contact with the Allies, they can get us out. Mihailovich doesn't let them go. So they're not exactly prisoners, but they're not free to go either, because he wants to use them to regain favor with the Allies. In the end, the Chetniks become surrounded, their position becomes hopeless. Mihailovich comes to the Americans, addresses them, and gives each of them one of these gold sovereigns that the British had given him. And this is an image of one of the gold sovereigns that Mihailovich gave to Blank that his son still has. Quite the souvenir. And Mihailovich gives them a speech. They go off basically into the middle of the battlefield. Somehow they survive and manage to convince the partisans that they're not Chetniks, that they're Americans, which wasn't so easy. And they make it out with the partisans. So, and these men that I just described are the last Americans to see General Mihailovich alive. Mihailovich, his army was destroyed. He went to hiding for, I forget, maybe 6 months, until 1946 anyway. He was finally captured and then executed after a show trial by Tito's men. And then they come home. And this is a picture of my father with my mother. She was married in a wedding dress made of the parachute that he carried across Yugoslavia. That picture appeared in she was from Buffalo. That appeared in the Buffalo newspaper. And that's the picture from the article. And that story and the image was picked up by all the wire services and flashed all over the country. It appeared in newspapers all over the country. So they had their 15 minutes of fame because of that parachute wedding dress. And it also talks about the other men and how they, what happened to them after they came home. We've talked about a lot of those issues that the men endured about post-traumatic stress and so on. So that's basically the story. John said, the book's not out yet. I'm circulating inquiries among agents right now. There's a whole process there that I can describe to you later on if you're interested. And hopefully by this time next year it'll be in print. So what I like to do is ask, if you're interested in the book, I have kind of a sign-up sheet here, and what I'll do is take your email addresses, and if you are interested in getting it sometime, just give me your email address, and when it comes out, when I find a publisher, I'll send out a notice, and when it comes out, I'll send you another notice saying that it's out, and you can get it if you want. So anyway, thank you very much.